what I want to show you now is how you can create a more customizable fog layer uh, for lower parts of your scenes or even higher altitudes. Something that's going to render very quickly and have a lot more variation than just using the atmospheric fog. So you can load in this scene. That's what I'm going to be using. It's called Landscape for Fog. And I just kind of have a preview render being shown right now. A bit of haze in the distance. And what we want to do is use a spectral cloud layer to have some nice fog interacting with the terrain. So we go to Atmosphere Editor, and I'm going to add in the dense cumulus layer from Spectral 2. And we need to make a few modifications. I'm going to set the altitude to 0, and we can change the height to about 350 or so meters. We can reduce the detail amount to under 20%, and I'm going to be removing pretty much all of the altitude variation. Now, one of the things that takes the longest to render is the internal shadows. So if we edit the material, go to Lighting and Effects, we can turn off the internal shadow, and we're going to have a very minimal layer, not going to have a lot of density. So I'm also going to turn off the Cast Shadows option, because we're not going to need it. I do want to make some modifications to the density production. Right now we have Fractal node generating this. What we can do is just select the fractal and add in a noise node. Whether or not you want to use the ridged noise, it's really up to you. I'm going to turn off the ridged and also remove the brightness and contrast. So if we go ahead and close this out and now take a look at the render, we have a nice fast rendering fog layer. Right now it's still a little too dense, unless this is what you're looking for. One thing that's really going to help improve the look of this type of fog is to turn on projected shadows on fog, and that way we get some of the shadows from the terrain onto the cloud layer. So we can go into the Sky Fog and Haze tab, turn on projected shadows on clouds. If it's not on, it should be on for this scene. And then we can go over to clouds and reduce the density to about 5%. And I'm going to go ahead and render that out again. And now we're going to see something that looks a lot better, a lot more variation, and a nice interaction with the terrain. We can adjust the color. If we want to darken this a bit, we can modify the color or reduce the ambient lighting, or both. So if we open up the Atmosphere Editor, F4 on the keyboard, we can take the ambient lighting, basically turn it off. If you wanted to reduce the detail amount more, you can. That'll also improve rendering speed. And then if you edit the material, lowering the roughness, because we're not really using the detail layer all that much. We can also go ahead and take the uniformity and set it to 0. If you want to reduce sharpness and feathering, that can also help improve the look, increase the opacity just a little. And now we have a very smooth, very fast rendering fog. If we want to have more variation, we can reduce the cover amount. So go ahead and bring that down to 59. And it is a little more patchy, not seeing as much of the function. So if we need to increase the cover to 72, we can boost that a little bit more, and now we're seeing it start to show up just kind of around the terrain. If you need to increase the overall height in order to fill it in a little bit more or pick up some of these lower areas, that will also help. So let's go ahead and bring it up to about 433 meters. And now we have some nice dense patches along with these lighter areas that are just kind of poking through the terrain. I think that towards the back, the fog's a little too bright. So what I want to do is go into that material and just take the volumetric color, make it a little bit darker, still sticking with grayscale. And you could choose to use the altitude variations, increase it more if you want. I have noticed more of a spiky look to the altitude variation in some cases. Slightly better blend now with the haze in the background. The darker we make the fog. We will need to either increase the cover amount or increase density to fill in some of those spots if needed. So this is a very fast rendering low fog. If you want a slightly better quality, you can turn on the internal shadow. It's going to take about 3 times longer to render in most cases. Depending on your lighting and density settings, it can take up to 10 times longer. It's really going to depend on how much light is shining through. Without having to calculate the shadows, it's going to render, of course, very quickly. And whether or not you need the shadows on or to have them on, it's really going to depend on the scene. In this case, I don't think that the shadows are really benefiting it all that much because it's such a low density amount. There's really not a whole lot of coverage, and it does look kind of nice around some of the edges having those internal shadows, but it just may not be necessary for the shot. Majority of the lighting on this type of layer is going to be controlled a lot by the ambient light color. If we were to take this and reduce it to almost black, we will see a dramatic change in the entire scene because the haze is no longer being lit by that color, and you'll also be able to see that those clouds and that fog layer will change their color to more of the decay color rather than the ambient light color. And that's going to depend on the position of the sun. I'm going to go back to the cloud layer and just turn off the internal shadows. GI ambient lighting doesn't make that large of a difference in the render time for this type of a cloud. I'm going to go ahead and increase the height a little bit more. We can take a look at a little more of the landscape and render this out. So it's a pretty efficient way to create a nice little fog layer. Interacts very well with ecosystems as well. And because there's really not having to worry about the shadows internally, overall it's a huge speed increase to alternative methods. And as of version 7.5, you can really customize the lighting on those clouds by adjusting the cloud scattering, and then also, of course, the haze and aerial perspective, depending on the scale of the scene, is going to make a big impact. So I'm going to go ahead and save out this version of the scene as landscape_fog_fin, and that way you can load that in and take a look at it. And here's a scene, just a terrain with a maple tree ecosystem on it, using that fog layer. And I just have the lighting set up for a shadow map. And you can see the projected shadow onto the cloud, but also the shadow underneath it because of the density. The shadow map I do have set to, let's go ahead and take a look. Double click on the sunlight. Use shadow map, soft shadow map, using the auto size with a ratio of 2. Using a ratio larger than 1 to create a denser shadow, basically. The ratio itself, 1 being equal to the scale of the render output. So the larger we increase the ratio, the denser of a shadow we can get. That helps improve the shadows on the leaves of trees so that it's not completely blurred out in a very flat shadow.